delighted that you're here today. I'm Nancy Gilbert. I am a library trustee here, and I'm also on the foundation board and the Friends board. And so I welcome you. I'm so glad that you're here today. I wanted to tell you that this is part of the foundation's distinguished lecture series, and we're really thrilled to have Stephen Puleo here with us today. I just want to mention briefly about the foundation a bit, because people are often confused about what's the difference between the foundation and the Friends, for example. So, in essence, the Friends deals with kind of the important work of ongoing library events. The foundation is looking further down the road in terms of building an endowment that will help with larger projects in the future. So that's kind of how we complement each other in that way. So we look to provide means beyond and above the library's normal everyday activities and events, and we have to do that by building our endowment. So that's what we're all about. I invite you to visit the library's website if you haven't already, and under the tab Get Involved, you will see information on the Friends, the foundation, and events in the library. So, without further ado, as they say, we are delighted to sponsor author, historian, teacher, and public speaker Stephen Puleo, who's here to discuss his most recent book, Voyage of Mercy, the USS Jamestown, the Irish Famine, and the remarkable story of America's first humanitarian mission. This is what Wall Street Journal had to say. Puleo has found a new way to tell the story of the Irish famine with this well-researched and splendidly written chronicle of the Jamestown, its captain, and an Irish priest who ministered to the starving in Cork City. Mr. Puleo's tale, despite the hardships to come, surely is a tribute to the better angels of America's nature. And in that sense, it couldn't be more timely. Stephen is a former award-winning newspaper reporter and contributor of articles and book reviews to publications and organizations that include American History Magazine, Politico, the Boston Globe, and the Bill of Rights Institute. He has taught at Suffolk University in Boston and at UMass Boston, and has published 7 narrative history books. The first of which, my book group just recently read, Dark Tide, The Great Boston Molasses Flood of 1919. If you haven't read it, you're missing out. I will also note that Stephen and his wife Kate donate a portion of his book proceeds to the Juvenile Diabetes Research Foundation. So with that, I will turn it over to you, Steve.
Thanks. Thanks. I'm going to try this mic. Can you guys hear me okay? Sure. I think it's just a little easier if I use that, even though I do project well. But I think this might be better overall. So I'm going to use it. And thanks so much for being here, Shrewsbury. I got a chance to look at your library. It's beautiful. You know, I know it's relatively new. It's like 6 years old now, I think. So wonderful to see. You guys should be really proud of the library. I live in Weymouth, just south of Boston. I like coming out to Worcester County. I love little towns around here. I remember when I spoke in Northborough, my wife Kate said, "Where's Northborough?" I said, "It's near Southborough." She said, "Where's Southborough?" I said, "It's near Marlborough." You know, it's one of those. But I really like it out here. It's a fun place. You have a very historic town, Shays Rebellion. I know all about that. You know, it's just a great place. I know that Henry Knox came through this town with his cannon from Fort Ticonderoga. So it's a lot of history in this town, and it's great to be here. And it's great to be at a place that I guess celebrates history and celebrates books and all of that. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Voyage of Mercy today, but when we when I finish, I want to get to questions and answers, and you guys should know that when I get to the Q&A part, anything is fair game. You can ask about the story, you can ask about the book, you can ask about publishing, authoring, anything like that. I get lots of questions about the writing process, always happy to answer those. And as I said, my favorite part of these events is that. So, and at the end, I'll be signing books, come up and say hello, all of that. I think we'll have a nice time. The day kind of cleared up, which is great. So that's good, and I know we're being Zoomed and live streamed and everything else. So hope everybody's enjoying it at home too. Just a little bit about the making of Voyage of Mercy that I'd like to share with you. So the book came out in 2020, the hardcover. The book launched 1 week before we shut down for COVID, literally. So my home Barnes & Noble, which is in Hingham, Massachusetts, I went in the week before, the week the book launched, and it's in a great spot. There's copies all over the place. There's an end cap that it's on. So I'm like, this is fantastic. And bang, we shut down 1 week later. And then when the Barnes & Noble reopened in late June, early July, I went back into the Barnes & Noble, and there were the books in the exact same spot, like this little layer of dust on it. It's very strange. My strangest book launch ever. But thanks to people like you, I have very, very loyal readers. They're wonderful. The book came out on schedule in paperback 1 year later, May of 2021. It's done very well. So thank you for that. But that was my launch of Voyage of Mercy. We all have strange stories from those couple of years past, and that was one of them. I described this book, or the story in this book, as this story of soaring goodwill and generosity amidst unfathomable despair. And it's the story on both sides of the Atlantic. The unfathomable despair, by the way, the Irish famine. And when we talk about the Irish famine, when we put a capital T, capital I, capital F, the Irish famine, we mean the famine that starts in the summer of 1846 and continues all through 1847 and into 1848. What the Irish call Black 47 because of how bad the year 1847. And I distinguish when I say the famine because there were lots of mini famines in Ireland prior, mini famines after. And I don't use that mini famine term glibly, I just use it to contrast with this horrific event that happened in the summer of 46 and all through 1847. So that's on one side of the Atlantic. On the other side of the Atlantic is this remarkable American response to the people of Ireland with tons and tons of food that Americans send to Ireland in what is not only America's first humanitarian mission, but really the world's first humanitarian mission. The notion of the people of one country helping the people of another country for purely altruistic reasons and humanitarian reasons was simply not part of the geopolitical discussion in 1847. Countries went to war with each other, countries burned each other's villages and destroyed each other's crops and ravaged each other's cities and occasionally traded together. But this notion of helping for humanitarian reasons didn't really happen until this 1847 mission. Pretty remarkable. So we'll start in Ireland. And just to kind of set the stage of the famine. By the way, who's of Irish heritage here? Anybody? Yeah, I get that a lot in Massachusetts. Almost everybody in the room, which is fantastic. I'm married into a large Irish family, so very familiar with the wonderful culture that's of the Irish. But the famine, people say to me, well, why is the Irish famine so remarkable, so historically important? Why is it carried down in folklore? Why is it in songs and poems, in movies, all of it? There have been much bigger famines in the 20th century, particularly in China and Russia and Africa, places in Asia, no question about it. But what is it about the Irish famine? And I think what I use to kind of put that in context is the percentage of people in a country that were affected, that were impacted. So think about this, and I don't throw a lot of numbers at you. I don't do slides, but I do throw some numbers at you to keep things in mind and in perspective. So Prior to the famine, the population of Ireland was about 9 million people. Post-famine years, most people define that as 1851, 1852. Post-famine years, the population of Ireland is 6 million people and declining. So about a third of the population disappears. Of those 3 million people, about 1.3 million, maybe 1.4 million, die of starvation and attendant diseases, scurvy, typhus, dysentery, due to the famine. The other 1.6 to 1.7 leave Ireland. Great Irish migration, great Irish diaspora, where they leave and go to places like England, reluctantly, other parts of the British Empire, reluctantly, including, by the way, India, Australia, and of course Canada. But most come here to the United States because things are just so bad. It's really the first great mass emigration across the ocean. In Massachusetts, of course, the largest immigrant group is the Irish, followed by the Italians, my people, many years later. But the Irish come first, and they come in great numbers, the greatest number, from about 1847 right up until the American Civil War, right up until 1860. That's the great number of Irish that come, and they come as a direct result of the famine. There are people that come before, Irish that come before, because things are never really great in Ireland, right? It's always a struggle. But that great body of Irish come between 1847 and the American Civil War. Just to give you a perspective. Those people that go to Canada, remember Irish is part of the British Empire, and because of the way the British handled the famine, which I'll get to in a second, many Irish are very reluctant to even go to Canada. But it's cheaper. It's cheaper to sail from the big embarkation point of Liverpool, England, to Canada than it is to sail directly from Liverpool to New York or Boston or Philadelphia or Baltimore. And those people that first go to Canada, Prince Edward Island, Nova Scotia, whatever, and make their way then down to places like Boston and New York, they're known as two-boaters in Irish Parliament. Some of you may be descendants of two-boaters that know your ancestors went to Canada first and then came to Boston. And so that's kind of how that migration pattern happens. And it happens when the Irish potato crop fails in its entirety. At a time when about 30% of the Irish population relies exclusively on the potato. Exclusively on the potato. Why? Why does a country rely so much on a potato? Answer. Irish tenant farmers that worked land owned by absentee British landlords, right, were given ever smaller and narrower plots of land to till, to harvest, to work. And really the only crop that provided a large enough yield to feed a large family, a family with maybe 6 children, 8 children, 10 children, and the Irish population and birth rate were going up prior to the famine. The only crop that provided that kind of a yield was the potato. And the potato, the Irish maybe were not aware at that time of food science, but as you guys know, the potato provides vitamins, minerals, calories, very important to the Irish diet. And it was also a huge cash crop. So if you had an abundant crop of potatoes, you could then take your leftovers and sell them and buy a pig or a cow or a farm implement or something to keep your family going. That's why so many people relied on the potato. And when Sir Charles Trevelyan, who's the British bureaucrat responsible for helping or assisting the Irish during the famine, does a very bad job at it. When he asks, what hope is there for a nation that lives on potatoes? That's his quote. He's oblivious to the irony that it's kind of the way the British treat the Irish that have put them in that position to begin with. So keep that in mind. Anti-Irish feelings and bitterness and rancor on the part of the British were long-standing prior to the famine, all the way back to 1695 with William of Orange on the throne, right? The penal laws that forbid Catholics from owning property, going to school, holding jobs, carrying guns, all of that. But it's the famine of 1846 and 1847 that really brings this to the surface. That really brings that rift between the Irish and the British to the surface. That rancor and that bitterness that lasts all the way up to 2000, I would say, and even into the 2000s, and maybe even a little bit still today. I see a couple people nodding. I think that's right. When you look at the famine, fascinating when I was doing the research, when you look at the famine, it's the underlying event that affects Irish-British relations and Irish-American relations, completely opposite, very good, very positive relations. But the Irish-British piece, fascinating. It affects the Irish independence movement in the 1920s. The famine is under there. It's under there in almost all the discussions and the debates. It affects the Irish position in the Second World War, when Ireland remains one of the 6 or 7 countries in the world neutral and in fact sympathetic to the Nazis, refusing Winston Churchill's request for help when Britain is standing alone in 1940 and early 1941, allowing Nazi people fleeing, Nazis who were fleeing Germany, to refuge in Dublin because of that battle between the British and the Irish. Members of the Irish Defence Force, some of them very upset with their own government's position in the war, during the Second World War, literally defect, thousands of them defect, and go to fight for the British, for the Allies, during the Second World War. And those folks, when they come back, thousands do come back, thousands stay out of Ireland, but thousands do come back, they are persecuted and prosecuted by the Irish government. They're worried when they get back that they'll be thrown in jail. They're not fully pardoned until 2012, 10 years ago. Members of the Irish, obviously elderly, very elderly members of the Irish Defence Force who are still alive, finally fully pardoned by the Irish government. The Irish government would not allow British ships fleeing from German U-boats to seek refuge in Irish ports or up near Clare Island, etc., because of that underlying rancor which the famine was part of. The troubles, the Irish troubles, in the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s, into the 90s, right? Yes, religious at its base. But again, when you read people who are involved in it, when you listen to some of the speeches that are given, when you read some of the speeches that were given, right, it's the famine that's underneath that. So in 1999, it's no surprise when you heard an Irish historian say, the famine has been the unseen guest at every Irish dinner table for 150 years. And I think that's really true. I think that's really true. And the folklore and the stories that get passed down, much of which is true, gets seared in the Irish memory. And so people say, well, what were some of those? One of them, one real strong one, is this notion that the British, which Ireland is part of Britain at this time. It's a unified country, right? It's the United Kingdom. The Irish became part of Britain in 1800. Get their independence in 1921, just so we're aware, 22. But part of the reason was the way the British decided to handle crops. Many crops and foodstuffs were exported from Ireland in the midst of this famine. That is true. The potatoes failed, but other Irish corn and grains were exported because the British did not want to disrupt the Irish corn markets, or the British corn markets as they were called, on the world market. very, very reluctant to do that. So one of the things that's seared into the Irish memory are these poor, starving Irish peasants, tenant farmers, in the midst of one of the coldest winters in history in Ireland. That is November, December of 1846, January, February, March of 1847, wandering the countryside without food, some without clothing, basically without clothing, while carts filled with food and grain, escorted by British soldiers, made their way to Irish ports. So that gets passed down generation after generation by the Irish. And to make matters worse, because most of the Irish at that point didn't have the potato crop had failed, didn't have extra potatoes to sell, they could not pay their rent, the absentee British landlords evicted them. In great numbers, by the thousands, they evicted them. That's one of the reasons why they are wandering the countryside. Many of their homes torn down around them, and when I say homes, mud huts, hovels, cabins, torn down around them because they couldn't pay their rent. And so you have these starving Irish in the freezing cold with no place to live. And so the word eviction gets seared into the Irish memory for years and years and years, both in Ireland and in the New World, here in the United States. One of the things the Irish do when they come to Boston and New York and Philadelphia and spread out is work extremely hard to buy homes because they couldn't be evicted from their own homes. If you owned it, you couldn't be evicted from it. It's the famine that's at the back of that. If your grandmother or great-grandmother or great-aunt or whatever bought their own home, chances are one of the reasons they decided to do it was because of what happened in Ireland in 1846 and 1847. If they sacrificed other things to buy their own property. That's how bad things were at the time. There was one observer, and lots of people went to Ireland during the famine in the United States to kind of chronicle what was going on. And there was one person who said, the only business that's operating, because everything's dead here, the only business that's operating is the sawmill. They're making the planks for the immigrant ships. They're making the planks for the fever sheds where these sick Irishmen are going. And they're making the planks for the coffins. Starvation begins very quickly. The crop fails in August of 46. By November, starvation is underway. Starvation is underway. The Irish basically eat all of the pigs and the goats and the rabbit and the cows by the end of November, and by December they're now eating dogs and horses. And those go very, very quickly as well, especially by 1847, the beginning of 1847. The British government is, to say the least, understatement of the year coming up here, extremely slow to respond. Now, I've had people say to me, was this a genocide? Was this a genocide by the British? Because during the years, I would say around 1945, let's say the end of the Second World War, use that, all the way up till about 1980, there was a school of Irish thought, Irish historians, Irish journalists who did call it a genocide. You know, when you look at history, you look at different periods of historiography, right, how people were writing. And there was that period of time when they did call it. I do not call it a genocide. If you use the official, I would say the official definition, which the UN creates as a word in 1948 to describe the Holocaust, right? That's where the word comes from. The UN definition is a state-sponsored extermination or attempted extermination of a people based on race or religion. And I don't see that here. And I think most historians agree with me. I don't always agree with a lot of historians, but I do here. And from about the mid-1980s till now, I think the general opinion, I think the correct opinion, is that the British response to the Irish famine was one of incompetence, indifference, inertia, impotence, anti-Catholicism, benign neglect, all of the above, horrible way that they handled it, but not a genocide. That's the little distinction that I make, and I think most people make. The British are a little embarrassed by the Irish, embarrassed by their dedication to Catholicism, their reverence for the church, embarrassed by their backwardness, right? 1846, 1847, that's the Industrial Revolution in London. I mean, people are eating bread pudding in London and, reading A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens that came out a few years prior around this holiday time, while Ireland is suffering. Ireland's a country that's backward. They're farmers. They're dusty. They have almost no internal roadway system. Their internal roadway system, by the way, is not that great now, but I'm saying in 1847, they had almost no internal roadway system. British are a little embarrassed. Can't they pull themselves up by their bootstraps? Can't they stop contributing to their parishes and save money to go buy their own, to fulfill their own needs? Can't they find something to grow beyond potatoes? All of that gets factored into the British response. There's no question about it. The British laissez-faire attitude gets factored into the response. No question about it. The British move really slowly. They don't start soup kitchens till about March or April, like around April of 47. Way too late. Hundreds of thousands have starved. By the way, 500,000 Irish children die in the famine. Die of starvation in the famine. Just put that in your head. Of that 1.3 I talk about later, about 500,000 of children. There's these heart-wrenching stories of mothers going to these poorhouses saying, I have 7 children, can you take 3 of them? Then I'll only have to try to scrap and scrape for food for 4. There's that kind of thing going on. That's the depth of despair that's in the family. That's going on in the family at that time. Somewhere around late January of 1847, the United States gets the full word of how bad the famine is. Now, prior to that, some of the Catholic parishes in Boston and other places, in November, December of 46, are seeking collections for the poor of Ireland, but there was this feeling, a bit of a boy who cried wolf feeling, because the people of Ireland had asked for donations prior for some of these mini families when the despair was not as great, let's put it that way. But sometime in late January of 47, a couple of ships arrive from Ireland. One in Boston, one in New York. And very, very quickly, word spreads about just how bad things are in Ireland. The United States moves pretty quickly. Starts here in Boston. In February, there's a huge meeting at Faneuil Hall where the city fathers and other prominent people gather to say, how can we help? What can we do? What should we do? Well, let's petition Congress to appropriate money. One idea. And a Boston ship captain by the name of Robert Bennett Forbes says, how about this? How about taking a couple of warships, retrofitting them, putting captains like me, civilian captains in charge, and we'll try to gather as much food as we can for Ireland and send it across the ocean. How's that for a possibility? They start working on that two-pronged way. Congress debates in late February the possibility of donating $500,000 to Ireland. President Polk gets word very quickly to Congress that if they pass that bill, he's going to veto it because he believes it's unconstitutional to send American money, government money, taxpayer money, to Ireland, to a foreign country. And so that switches very quickly. And so Congress debates a little bit more and decides on more of an advisory role. People like Daniel Webster, Henry Clay, big senators of the day, and others get together and start a committee, form a committee. And their committee is responsible for getting word out to every city and town in the United States, urging them to create their own committees for the relief of Ireland, to provide relief for Ireland. And that instead of using money whenever possible, how about direct food aid if possible? It'll get into the Irish people's hands faster. They need food desperately. That was the suggestion of this congressional committee. And lo and behold, almost every single city, town, village, frontier outpost in the United States, from Boston all the way west to Wisconsin at the time, Mississippi, the rural areas of Detroit, yes, very rural at the time. Every single one of those little municipalities sets up a committee for the relief of Ireland and sends about 10,000 tons of food to Ireland over about a 16-month period. Now think about this. When you contribute to charities today, how do you do it? You go online, you Venmo something here, you use your credit card here, you bring some stuff to your food pantry. Great, all good, by the way. That's what I do. The people of the United States at the time took food that they were going to have for their families or sell at the market. And they packed it up and they put it in kegs, they dried it, they cured it, they salted it, did all of that, put it on burlap sacks, put it on small boats that travel down the Ohio eastward, down the Erie Canal eastward, to the big ports, Boston and New York and Baltimore and Philadelphia. They keep appearing again and again, to put onto ships to go to Ireland. And in that 16-month period between March of 1847 and the 4th of July of 1848, 150 ships go to Ireland, filled with food, courtesy of the people of the United States of America. It's a remarkable, astonishing effort. Astonishing. And at the same time, Congress says to Robert Bennett Forbes, okay, we'll turn a couple of these older warships over. One to you, that's the USS Jamestown, and one to this captain in New York City, the USS Macedonia. And you guys can be responsible for making that initial sail to Ireland, that first sail across the ocean with food. The New York effort gets mired in bureaucracy. Robert Bennett Forbes gets to work right away. And on March 28th, 1847, that's how quick, I told you, we got word in January of 1847. On March 28, 1847, the Jamestown set sail, laden down with food, heading to Cork, the place that was hurt the most by the famine, that suffered the most. And that begins that astonishing delivery to Ireland. And people say to me, why? What happened, right? What happened that made the American people do this at that time? It's the first time it's ever happened, here or anywhere else. What kind of reached into their hearts and made them do this? And I say, I think there's a few factors that come together. When you read history and you look at sources, you don't always get a magical source like a sealed envelope that says, here's why the people of the United States contributed to Ireland. That doesn't really exist, right? So you have to put things together, connect some dots. And I think in this period, right in this little window, a few things are going on that converge to create this feeling of generosity and largesse from the American people. Number one, in the Northeast particularly, There are many progressives who are feeling a great deal of guilt about the Mexican War that's underway right then, right? 1846, 1847. They see the Mexican War and the acquisition of Texas as an extension of slavery. To some extent, that's correct. And they feel very guilty about it. And there's lots of talk that this help to Ireland might be a way to assuage some of that. Might be a chance for us to do some good in the midst of what's happening with the Mexican War. That's number one. Number two, we're in the midst, 1846, 1847, right around those years, of several reform movements. Mental health reform, prison reform, education reform, the abolitionist movement just getting its feet under it in 1847, the women's suffrage movement just getting its feet under it in 1847, right? Many people view this as another way to do good, another way to show beneficence as these other areas were happening. This time beyond our borders, overseas. That's happening right now. Number three, we are in the middle, 1847, right smack in the middle of the second great American reawakening, about 100 years after the first, led by the Protestant churches, for the most part. And basically, you can read thousands of pages about the second great American reawakening, but let me give it to you very, very basically. It says, ordinary people don't have to wait for church elders to help others. They can do it on their own. That's kind of the message of the second great American reawakening. The Protestant churches, very instrumental in this effort. Other religions too, like you might expect the Catholic parishes to be. But the Protestant church is very involved. The Quakers, extremely involved. Synagogues involved. This effort, right? Everybody, people of all geographies, people of all occupations, education levels, religions, they all take part in this. And the other final big reason, maybe one of the most important big reasons, 1846, first time the phrase manifest destiny was used. Now, you guys remember that from high school, manifest destiny, right? Manifest destiny has lots of, it's kind of gotten a bum rap in the last century and a half, and for some good reasons. But this was a period of time when people were what? Pulling up stakes. The year of decision, 1846, that's what it was called. People in the East pulling up stakes and going across the country in various ways to seek their fortune, to seek a new life. And so there are negative parts to manifest destiny, but one of the virtuous parts, and one of the important parts, goes something like this. We live in a country with acres and acres and acres of arable farmland, miles and miles of navigable rivers, and ports that are teeming with fish. We have an obligation to help others. We have an obligation to help others. And I think that all of those reasons kind of come together for this period that lead the people of the United States to help the people of Ireland during the worst of their famine. Think about that. That's what's going on at the time. And let me tell you this too. It sets up the manner in which people of the United States contribute things all the way till today. It's that public-private partnership. Yes, the government provides humanitarian aid, but so do you, separate from your government, by the way, your tax dollars, but so do you privately. Example, oftentimes you will hear statistics or radio reports or television reports, or you'll see something online that goes something like this. The United States does not give as much to international humanitarian causes per capita as other countries. Sometimes you'll hear that. Beware of what's being talked about. Most often, when you hear those reports, they're talking about the amount of government aid from countries. But I want you to think about this. In 2019, which is the last time these numbers get aggregated, and I think it'll probably be another couple of years before new ones come out. But in 2019, the United States gave $120 billion to international humanitarian aid. Not to be confused with military aid, this is humanitarian aid, $120 billion. $50 billion of that came from the United States government, which, by the way, is you. Tax dollars, $50 billion of that. The other $70 billion came from you and millions of people like you through your private donations. United Way, Catholic Charities, United Jewish Philanthropies, you name it, NGOs that you contribute to. Now, right now, this time of year, you're getting 20 of these in the mail every day. These private, yes, right? You're getting 20 of them every day on contributions that you should make privately. Those private donations, that big block, more than the government donation, is unique to the United States. It's not that there aren't private donations from other countries. I'm not saying that. I'm saying when you hear that stat about the per capita amount, that's almost always government contributions. That public-private partnership I'm talking about started in 1847, 175 years ago this year, by the way. Wait, I was going to minus the one, carry the two. Yes, 175 years ago this year. And continues to this day. I want to say one other thing here, and it's about the two major characters in this story. Nonfiction. When I say characters, I mean real-life characters, right? They exist in nonfiction works as they do in fiction work, except I can't make them up. I have to base it on the sources. So number one is Robert Bennett Forbes, the ship captain. Unbelievable guy. Now, when you hear the name Robert Bennett Forbes, don't lie to me, you're automatically thinking this is a person born with a silver spoon in his mouth. This kind of Forbes background, lineage. And I'll tell you, nothing could be further from the truth. He is a self-made man. He became a millionaire by the time he was 30, lost it all probably about 5 or 6 years later, regains it all by the time he's 40. Spends more time at sea than almost anyone of his age, almost of any age, or any era. He talks about between the ages of 17 and 27, in that 10-year period, he spent 6 months on firm ground, the rest of it at sea. Takes his first voyage across the Atlantic when he's 6 years old, when his mother drags him and his brother to go after their ne'er-do-well father who's left the family on some excuse. At the age of 13, he's a cabin boy to China. At the age of 20, commands his first ship to China. He's in the opium trade, which is legal at the time. Controversial later, but legal at the time. Loses his entire fortune a couple of years after he's married. He and Rose, Robert Bennett Forbes and his wife Rose, have lost 2 children, basically at birth, well after birth, and had an 8-month-old. And the Panic of 1837 hits. He loses it all, and in 1838 he says to Rose, I'm going to China for a couple of years to regain our competence, to earn our money. We're broke, Rose. Leaves Rose with an 8-month-old, and I got to read all the letters between Rose and Robert Bennett Forbes in those 2-year period, between 1838 and 1840, when he returns, and they are so powerful. And they show the relationship between the two of them. It's very, very difficult for Rose. She's left back here with no money, an 8-month-old. She contemplates suicide. She almost has a nervous breakdown. Some friends are helpful, not great, but helpful. And their letters go back and forth. And remember, it takes 5 months for these letters to cross sometime, 4 or 5 months. So much so that Robert Bennett Forbes says to Rose, please number and date your letters So I know what I'm responding to, and you kind of know what I've already told you. You know, that's how that communication has to happen. Much different than today when you send a text, right? So that 2-year period, I think in some ways the couple becomes even stronger. When Robert Bennett Forbes gets back in 1840, Rose basically says, "You need to stay home now. We need to build our family." In between 1841 and 1847, they have 3 more children. And so when this mission comes up to Ireland in 1847, Robert Bennett Forbes volunteers to take the Jamestown to Ireland. And when Rose says why, Robert Bennett Forbes' response is, because it's not an everyday matter to see a nation starve. That's why I do it. She wishes him well, and he does the mission. So that you're going to like this Robert Bennett Forbes character. It's really interesting. You're going to like Rose, too, as a character. The other major character on the other side of the Atlantic is the priest, Father Theobald Matthew, in Cork City, who helps the Irish in enormous ways during the famine. He is known as the people's priest, populist priest, a priest who holds confessions at 5 a.m. and 11 p.m. because most of his flock works in the fields. He's Irish. They can't get there any other time. He's a priest that learns Gaelic because many Irish in the countryside don't know English. He's a priest who warns the Catholic hierarchy, do not forsake these people because they are poor. They are the ones that build our churches, that keep our educational institutions going, and that feed and clothe us. In the 1830s, prior to the famine, he develops this reputation as the people's priest during the cholera epidemics that besiege Ireland. He works in the fever sheds. He helps the poor Irish, ministers to them as they're dying, and becomes internationally renowned without leaving Ireland when he gets hundreds of thousands of Irish to sign a temperance pledge, an anti-drinking pledge. He believes alcohol and alcoholism is ruining Ireland in the 1830s, and he gets hundreds of thousands to sign this pledge. He becomes known as the Apostle of Temperance. And without leaving the country, becomes world renowned. And so when the famine hits in 1840, he continues these works of mercy, these corporal works of mercy. When he can, he shares food. When he can, he shares money with these starving peasants. He allows them some to stay in his home. He builds a Catholic cemetery at his parish to bury the dead. He is the person that again and again and again writes to Sir Charles Trevelyan and the Queen, begging them to help the Irish. The food of a whole nation has perished. Distress is universal, is one of the letters that he writes. And so when Forbes comes across the ocean to Cork City, and it's a big moment, by the way, the cover of Voyage of Mercy is the painting that depicts the Jamestown arriving in Cork. He comes into the harbor, and on the hillside are bonfires and lamps in the windows. They're ready. The Irish are ready for him. They are expecting him. They are anticipating him. And when he comes, he meets Father Theobald Matthew. Matthew comes on board the Jamestown. The two men shake hands. It's this reverential, providential moment among the Irish. They're the Savior they know, Father Theobald Matthew, and the Savior from across the ocean, Robert Bennett Forbes, who they don't know, meet. Very, very dramatic moment in this story. So, keep this in mind. You're a very generous people when you hear those stats. You do a great job contributing to charities. This model that Robert Bennett Forbes and the American people started in 1847 continues today. And as we approach Thanksgiving and Christmas and the holiday season, I would say, keep up the good work. Thank you very much. we'll get to questions. I need a drink of water if that's okay. Thank you. The other thing is, if I can hear the questions, you'll hear them. I'll repeat them. So don't feel like you have to stray. Who's first? Don't be shy. Yeah.
Why was Cork the hardest hit area of Ireland?
Yeah, so why was Cork the hardest hit area of Ireland? I don't think anyone knows. I know this. The potato crop fails first in Cork. So there's a scene in the book where Father Theobald Matthew is walking in one direction and literally writes later about how luxurious the potato crop was. It's beautiful. 2.5 weeks later, he's walking back to Cork and it's black. So I guess the conjecture is, I think it's probably the best way to look at it is, the potato crop fails first there. And so they're in misery the longest, you know? And so they really do get hit. Places like Skibbereen, awful, you know, like just, it's you know, some of the real, it's really interesting, some of the real graphic stuff, and I have some in here, but you have to be careful when you're writing this because, you know, people don't want to read like 50 pages of this children starving and skeleton, right? They don't. It's just not a way to come at it. And what's interesting, people who chronicled it in the moment, in that year, almost did the same thing. Like they'd say, here's an example. There are these 5 people who I walked into their hut and they are lying dead by a burned out fire. The embers are cold. I saw things that were much worse, but I can't comment on, you know, like that. It's so interesting the way it played out, but yeah, it's a good question. What else? Yes, sir.
Well, that's a good point. How good are the statistics of the people who died? I mean, how valid are they?
Yeah, how valid are the statistics? You know, in other words, the numbers of people who passed.
Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, there's great, I would say, really good census reports, and the Irish government, and by the way, the British government, has very meticulous records. Now, they can't capture everybody. There are periods of time during the famine when the number of deaths, the volume of deaths is so great that what we call medical examiners, coroners, right, no longer even listed the cause of death. So funerals almost stop entirely. So at the beginning of the famine, there's a number of funerals. You know, there's 12 funerals a day, you know, 40 funerals a week, whatever. But then funerals almost stop entirely because the numbers are so great. So there's no exact number. But this number of about 3 million out of a population of 9 seems to be pretty accurate when you put everything together. And the Irish population, by the way, should also point out, didn't say it during the presentation, but has never recovered. Population of Ireland today is 4.5, 4.7, somewhere in there, million people. It's small. It's half what it was pre-famine. Shocking. Yeah. Good question. Yes, sir. Way in the back, then I'll come to you.
Were the Irish able to get access to fish?
Yeah, great question. Were the Irish able to get access to fish? Lots of talk about that. Not only among the Irish, but also among the British, and people in the United States. Couple reasons, or several reasons, I think, why not. Number one, the Irish coast is enormously difficult to fish. Don't be thinking of it like a Boston harbor or New York harbor. It's very rocky, hazardous. It's very, very hard to fish. Some of the Irish fishermen that did work, and a lot of those were in the north, you know, up near Giant's Causeway, up in that area, and sort of that whole northern area of Belfast. Many of them had sold both their fishing equipment, like tackle, things like that, and boats, small boats, in the couple of years prior to the famine for cash because of those mini famines. So the destitution or the poverty was so great that they would sell them for cash. And so in terms of the difficulty of the fishing, some of the expertise, there weren't a lot of great fishing in Ireland. Like, it's almost counterintuitive, right? It's an island, like you're thinking, but it isn't. It wasn't like Norway, for example, where that has thousands and thousands of great fishermen. So between the lack of expertise, the lack of equipment, and the difficulty fishing, it really doesn't become a huge option. Yeah, it's kind of shocking. great question. I agree with you though. Yes.
I was wondering if the American Irish took a leadership role in this effort, because as I understand it, the 2 decades preceding the famine, there was already significant migration of the Irish to America.
Yeah, so I'm sorry, the first part of your question was, did the American Irish take a
Leadership role
in this
not
effort?
Organizing things.
Oh, yes,
Yeah,
absolutely,
academic
yes.
research in this country.
Yes, so you're absolutely right that, so Irish start migrating here in, I would say, decent numbers, 1830, 1829, 28. The Irish convent, I think, is 1834, that gets burned to the ground in Charlestown, I think, right in that period of time. So yeah, there's Irish here, and Irish laborers volunteer their time on St. Patrick's Day loading the Jamestown. The Jamestown's being loaded on St. Patrick's Day. Irish stevedores and dock workers volunteer their time. So there is lots of help. Yes, I think almost unspoken is the kind of Irish and the general Catholic response. It's enormous. What's stunning is these other religions, these other nationalities, people of other backgrounds who all chip in to help the Irish. There are not a large, there's a small, but not a large Irish population in Steubenville, Ohio, for example. Steubenville, Ohio, right on the Ohio River, contributes a lot of food to Ireland at the time. So it's almost I won't say obvious or kind of, you would expect the Irish to help, and they did, but it's these other people that help that is just really amazing. Kind of gets you excited. Gets me excited, if you can't tell. Yeah. Yeah.
So my family came from West Cork, and I've often tried to figure out, well, what was their life like, during the famine? And outside of parish records and census, if it's available, I haven't found a lot of information. So I'm curious how you did your research and what were your sources?
Yeah, so let me ask you, did you guys all hear that? So, yeah. No. Okay, so she said her family came from West Cork, did you say? Yeah, and she's found some parish records. She's trying to do some background, but hasn't found too much else. So what are the sources that I used in general for her? So one thing I would say is, did your ancestors become citizens?
Yes.
Okay, so have you tried looking for their naturalization petitions?
I do have that. I was just trying to figure out, well, what would their life have been like, in their area during the famine, and how did they survive? So
yeah.
I'm curious how you did your research.
Yes, so I would say 2 different pieces, or 2 major buckets, right? On the United States side, and then I'll get to the Irish side. The United States side, Robert Bennett Forbes, by the way, not only is he a doer, but he's an amazing writer, wrote hundreds and hundreds of letters, wrote ship's logs, diaries, writes a whole summary on the Jamestown mission. All his papers are at the Mass Historical Society. Letters between him and Rose, all of that is great. On the other side, lots of great sources from Parliament. There's the Devon Commission that was formed literally to look at the famine in each of the different provinces. Counties. Sorry, I got Italy on my mind. Counties, and very detailed reports on not only would I say number of deaths and disease, but also conditions and things of that nature. The Crown does a couple of major reports. There's lots of smaller county level and even beneath that reports that are almost all digitized. You should be able to find these relatively quickly so that you won't find, what's your last name?
Donovan.
You may not find the Donovan family, right? But you'll find people who are really similar to the Donovan family, There's also letters, many letters, that were written across the ocean. The Pendergast letters are some of the most famous that are, they're in my bibliographic essay, which is not to say, I'm not saying you must buy a book. I'm saying feel free to browse through it if you want. But the Pendergast letters are really famous, that where some of the family emigrates to the United States, some stays in Ireland, and letters go back and forth. In this case, the children come, and the parents, like as the months and years go on, you can follow the parents saying, "Oh my God, things are worse than I ever thought they would be. Oh my God, now this neighbor has died." That kind of thing. So I might try that if you can't specifically get into your family, if that's helpful to you. Yeah, and I think seriously, the bibliographic essay has a lot of those kinds of reports that you can take a look at. You know, on your own. Yeah. What else? Did I see? Yeah.
I'm
Yes.
curious about what writers of history, authors of history, have inspired you in your endeavors.
Yeah, authors of history, writers of history. So yeah, I mean, I'm inspired by, I was inspired by McCullough, who just passed away. I think his best books were John Adams and Truman. I didn't think all of his books were great. I just tell it like it is, right? That's how I feel. I feel Truman and Adams were sensational, his biographies. But there's lots of writers today, like I read this woman, Candace Millard. She wrote this book called Destiny of the Republic. If you haven't read it, recommend you read it. It's about the Garfield assassination. You will never feel the same way about Garfield again, if you feel anything about him. It's really good. And she also wrote a book called River of Doubt, which is about Teddy Roosevelt's trip down the Amazon after his presidency. You read it? It's great, isn't it? It's great.
Amazing.
She's really good. I really like her a lot. I read Eric Larson. I think some of his stuff's great and some of it's just okay. Now, I say this, he shares his agent, shares the same agency as me. I don't know him. I'm not saying that. I'm saying, like, I love Isaac Storm, which is one of his first books about the Galveston hurricane. Stunningly good. I thought The Splendid and the Vile, I think that's his most recent, was good. I thought he spent too much time on Churchill's family. But that's fine. That's just like a preference thing. He writes well, tells a good story. Like, my general advice to people when they read history, find someone who tells a good story. Like, for me, it's all about the story. You can look at my bibliographic essay to see the layers of research and sources, because those are critical. You can't do good narrative history, which is what I do, without a lot of primary sources. You have to have primary sources. But it's all about the story. I want you to learn the big history almost in spite of yourself as you go through the story and say, wow, I'm really enjoying the story. Oh yeah, okay, this was happening too. Yeah, I didn't know it. But that's what I want you to do. I want you to have my book next to your nightstand, flip through it and say, oh, it's only 2.5 pages until the section break. I can do that before I go to bed. Because that's how readers read, right? Like, I don't need to read, I can't, when I buy a book, when I look at a book, I'll be honest with you. When I look at a book, if I see 30 pages of uninterrupted section breaks, I don't buy it. I'm just telling you the way I look. I love history. I read history all the time. But I'm just like, you are not required to be bored reading history. No matter what you learned in high school, you are not required to be bored reading history. There's a lot of really good writing out there. This guy named Jay Winnick, W-I-N-I-K, wrote April 1865, the month that changed America. Fantastic. Wrote Ordeal of something. I can't remember the title of it, but it's about the American Revolution and its relationship to the French Revolution and what's going on in Catherine the Great's Russia at the time. They're all happening at the same time. Great book. You'll have to excuse me on the title.
I was just going to ask.
No, go, please. I'll go on forever. I don't, yes.
No, I was going to ask you, I missed the title, but you just said you can't.
I can't quite remember. It's got the word ordeal in it.
Who's the other?
Jay Winnick.
No. That's Winnick.
Yeah.
Jay Winnick. Ordeal of something, whatever ordeal. American Revolution, French Revolution, Catherine the Great's Russia is fantastic. Can't put it down. S.W. Gwynn writes about Civil War stuff. S.G. Gwynn. Sorry, S.G.G.Y. I can't remember this one. Anyway, he's great. So there's these kind of people that are just wonderful writers. They tell a great story. Listen, the second part of that word history is story, right? So always insist that whoever you're reading tells a good story. That's what I would say. And otherwise, don't be overly forgiving to writers who don't. I'm not saying there's not great researchers, there's a lot of great researchers and people who know history. You have to have the ability to translate that into a good story. That's all I'm saying. So, and there's enough of those people around that you don't have to suffer. You don't have to suffer. So, just talking. What? Yes, Kate.
Great upheaval.
The Great Upheaval, not ordeal. The Great Upheaval. I knew it was like ordeal or upheaval. The Great Upheaval. Read that book. It is really good. Really good. Okay. What else? Yeah.
You can go first.
Oh, no, I just want to say that the whole idea of narrative history is what is so appealing to me. Because, like you said, it tells a story. It's like I mentioned that we read Dark Tide
Yes.
with my book group. And because you told a lot of the backstories, you know, you developed the characters,
Yeah.
which are real characters.
They're characters, yes,
And so
they're
that
real.
you are invested in what happens to them.
Yeah.
Because you feel like you know them a bit.
Yes.
So
Thanks.
that-
I mean, listen, I talk to a lot of would-be authors. You know, I do a lot of workshops, writing workshops, etc. And I tell nonfiction writers and history writers, you know, sometimes you can be nonfiction without being history, right? But it's good for you if you don't read any fiction. I read a lot of fiction. I read it for enjoyment, but I also read it. I say you need to read fiction because you need to bring in some fiction elements into your nonfiction work. What do I mean by that? You need to know when to break a scene so that your reader says, ooh, I gotta read the next scene, right? You gotta know how to pace a narrative because there's narrative in nonfiction. You gotta figure out how to tell the story. There's a narrative to it. So I always tell people who aspire to write nonfiction history, read good, fast-moving fiction. Because when I write, you know, a lot of times people say, like, who do you write for? Do you have a person in mind? And here's who I have in mind, you guys. You know, I mean that. Like, I don't write for critics. I don't write for my agent. I write for, what's your first name?
Mary.
I write for Mary. So here's what I'm thinking. Mary has a ton of stuff going on. You know, has to pick up her grandkids or whatever you're doing, you know, works, does this, does that. Like, I'm competing for your time. That's what I'm doing with my book. And I need you to carve a little part out of your day to read some of my book. So I better write a pretty compelling story is how I look at it. So that's I have a picture of Mary on my monitor. No, but, you know, like a symbolic Mary is on my monitor. That's what I think about when I write. So that's long answer to your
Yes.
question, but yeah, what else? Yeah? Yes, sorry. Should have come back to you.
That's okay,
Yeah.
I have two questions.
Yeah.
But I'm gonna let you pick which two they are. Well,
Wait.
wait.
I don't know, wait, clairvoyancy is not mine,
These
okay.
are my questions.
Oh, okay, yes, go ahead.
Okay, so
Yeah.
I'm gonna give you three options and you just pick two. The options are one about Parliament, one about Polk, P-O-L-K, one about the priest. Which two? Parliament, Polk, or?
I'll take, for 200. No, I'll take Polk and the priest. Yeah, although I do like the alliteration you came up with. That's good, but go ahead.
So you mentioned that Polk,
Yeah,
he had some constitutional doubts about giving aid to the
Right.
foreign country. What was he pointing to something in the Constitution that?
so, no, so I think a couple things, so, I'm sorry. The question is, Polk had some constitutional issues with the contributing of the $500,000. Was he pointing to something directly in the Constitution? No, he was not. I think a couple things were at work. One, maybe three things. One, his general feeling that this doesn't sound right constitutionally. You know? Like, you know, he's interpreting, I would say. Two, not only Polk had this reservation, why should the American people help this, you know, like the American government, when the British government isn't doing hardly anything? That's two. And then three, more specifically, and again, when you do history, right, sometimes unrelated stuff comes into play. We have to be careful here. We are right in the middle of negotiating with the British for what? For what? Anybody know? For Oregon territory. Were you going to say that?
Yes.
No, you weren't. No, you were. I'm only kidding. Yes. For Oregon territory. So we want Oregon territory in 1847. That's a British possession at that time. So we're in the middle of that. So that's delicate. So all of that goes into Polk's, I think, feeling. So I think he uses the constitutional argument as maybe a little cover. You know, I'm not saying it's that nefarious. I'm saying that there's other stuff he's worried about too.
Mhm.
Yes.
Yes,
All
I
right.
found that interesting because we're in a little bit of a controversy with giving aid to foreign country, like to Ukraine. Some people find that to be problematic.
Yeah.
Sort of not to get into it, but I just found that.
No, I think that's right. I think you're right on. I think it's always an issue, and there are different reasons for it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, in that example, the Ukraine example, it's both some humanitarian, but most is military. So the military aid thing's a whole different thing, right? But yeah.
Mhm.
All right. Well, I'm
Okay,
sorry. What was my other choice? What was,
Parliament for 200.
was the problem?
No, the priest.
No, the priest.
Priest.
The priest.
Priest, you mentioned that, yeah, I don't remember how much it was, but you have the money. So, you mentioned that, that the priest.
Father Matthew. Yep.
Yes, so he was doing a lot of helpful things to people in Ireland. So there was probably a lot of people who responded in appreciation for what he was doing. I was curious, in a time of national disaster, if there was a general kind of like return to religion as people were trying to find hope or trying to find solace during a hard time.
So you say in Ireland, was that
Ireland.
kind of return to
Yeah.
religion? So I will say this: the Irish never lose their fervor for religion and Catholicism, even during the worst of this time. One of the disparaging remarks that British, in fact, I think it's Trevelyan, makes is an Irishman would rather use his money to pay to commemorate the soul of a dead child than to put food in the mouth of a living one, for his mass, pay for the mass, basically. So that religious, fervor never goes away. It's what frustrates the British sometimes, because, there's this feeling like the Irish are relying on prayers when they should be figuring out what other crops to plant. That kind of stuff, that kind of thing. So, yeah, it's a good question. Really good questions in general. Yes. Yeah.
I'm going to ask another question.
Oh.
Would it have been in Britain's interest for Ireland to be doing well? But I'm thinking, in light of what you just said, if they felt that they were helping Ireland and Ireland wasn't doing their part fully to help themselves, would that be part of why?
Yeah, so I think that's a great observation. The question or the point was probably it would have served Britain well to help the Irish, but if they felt like the Irish weren't doing enough to help themselves, might that be one reason why they didn't jump right in? Yeah, I think that is in there, that whole, why aren't they pulling themselves up by the bootstraps? Because eventually, by the way, I should say this to the British, right? Eventually these soup kitchens, when they open in April of 47, end up feeding about 3 million Irish people, which is astonishing for a country with no interior roads, by the way. But leading up to that, the soup kitchen discussion is almost all bureaucratic. So the British come out around February of 47 with, here are going to be the rules for the soup kitchen. Here's who gets to go. Here's how long you can stay. Here's how you enter the kitchen. Here's how you leave the kitchen after you've eaten. So before like a single bowl of soup is served, the British are dithering. It's like Nero fiddling while Rome's burning. They're dithering with these rules and regulations and bureaucracies before any soup is served. So that's why it takes so long to start. But eventually they do serve, but it's way too late. It's way too late. Yes, sir.
You mentioned in the book that part of Scotland, or I don't know how much Scotland was affected by it.
Yep.
How was that?
Part of Scotland, the Scots rely on the potato, not as much. But in fact, the committee that in the Boston area in Massachusetts, its acronym is NECRIS, New England Committee for the Relief of Ireland and Scotland. That's the food that the Jamestown takes over. So Forbes makes a stop in Scotland as well after Cork, because there's also some issues on the western coast of France too, which relies more heavily on the potato too. So that blight hits all of it. It's just that Ireland focuses so much on it and relies so much on it that it just devastates their food supply. Yeah, it's good. Anyone who knows that we were negotiating for Oregon territory, man, that's really, yes. Let me just, yeah, you haven't asked yet, so.
Did Jamestown make other trips, and if so, was it with the same Captain Forbes?
Did the Jamestown make other trips and was it with the same captain? No and no. So the Jamestown goes over, comes back, those other 149 ships follow. The Jamestown eventually goes back into the Navy, so it becomes commissioned again. And, does some work along the African coast, does some work around Asia, and finally burns to the ground in a fire in Norfolk. I think it's 1913. It's in the epilogue. I think it's 1913. Yes. Yeah.
What draws you to certain narratives that you want to tell?
What draws me to certain stories and narratives that I want to tell? Yeah, I mean, so I always have like this little formula. One is, there's a few different pieces to it. So one is, is this going to hold my interest for 3 years? Right? Like, that's a long time. Like, you have to make sure you're going to like it. Because if I'm going to get bored, you're going to get bored when you read it. So is this an interesting enough thing that I'm going to enjoy being with it between research and writing for that 3-year time period, something like that. So that's one. Two, does this story have compelling characters? Cliff. When you're telling the story through the eyes of characters, are they characters you want to read about? Are they, characters you can invest in, right? Three, does the story or the event also have big picture implications? Like there's a bigger theme being told here, and so what is it? So that's, and then 4, I would say, do you have enough primary sources? And I can't emphasize the primary source thing enough, because one of the things I have to preempt, when you write narrative history, one of the things you have to preempt is, hey, did you make anything up? I'm used to reading dry, dusty, boring history, and this is interesting. Did you make it up? Like, that's kind of the implication. So you have to preempt that by resting your story on this foundation of primary sources. So all of my books, I do a bibliographic essay. I did it with Dark Tide, the first book, and it's basically an essay on the sources I used, how I used them, etc. I got such great response from readers. I really like that bibliographic essay approach, that I've done it in all my books. So instead of like your standard, here's the bibliography, I let you know how I use it, why I used it, all that kind of stuff. So you have a sense of how I did that. You have a sense of, all right, he's by my writing, you'll see, I make it very clear when I do engage in some kind of educated conjecture, right? Which all historians have to do. But you'll know that as a reader, because I'll say something like, no documentation exists to support this. However, based on Forbes's previous actions, this, and this. Okay, so right there that that's my conjecture, that's what I'm thinking, and it's based on this, but there's no. So I'll do that when I write, because I want you guys to know, So what I say in my bibliographic essay, almost every single one is, anything between quote marks exists in a letter, a diary, a government record, a law book, you name it, everything between quote marks. And the rest of the story, I tell my narrative based on those sources. That's the way I put it together. So all those kind of things come together to make sure, because I just need the thing to be really good and really supportive. So, does that answer your question?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. I feel like, if by the way, if I'm not answering a question, jump in, Yeah. Yes?
Can you tell us anything about what you're working on now?
So I will tell you this, book 8, there is a book 8, which is exciting. Turned the manuscript in a week and a half ago.
Oh.
I can't tell you the topic quite yet.
Okay.
But I'm very excited about it. It's good. It's very good. I love it. My wife Kate read it. She's one of my pre-readers, and she loves it. And I'll tell you, she's not easy. Like I'm telling you, it's not but she loved it. I'll probably announce it, I think, in my my e-message, my e-newsletter to readers in the new year. I'm doing one in December to kind of wrap up my fall, and then I think earlier in the new year I'll do a thing when I'll announce it. I think so far that's where I'm at, schedule-wise. Which, by the way, I meant to tell you, if you want to get, if you're not on my e-blast list, I have a thing, you just give me your email, and I don't, I do 3 or 4 of them a year. I had one lady say to me, now, I signed up for Williams-Sonoma, and I get something every day. It's like, no, I don't have time to do that. You'll get 3 or 4 a year from me. And I just kind of wrap up what I'm doing. Here's everything, all things Puleo that you readers would like to know. And so you'll be among the first several thousand people to know when I announce it. So there you go. What else? Oh, yes.
Did you get your degree in history?
I got my, I kind of have the best of both worlds. I got my undergraduate degree, my bachelor's in English, my master's in history. Started out my life, professional life in the newspaper business, so always had to be able to write kind of fast and well, and so yeah, it's been great. Been very blessed as an author. This is my 645th appearance as an author, 645, since Dark Tide came out in 2003. So I love readers. I love talking to readers. That's the other thing, by the way, any aspiring authors. I've talked to a lot of aspiring authors who say, I like the writing, but I don't think I like readers. Hello. Make sure you never say that to an agent or a publisher. And so I love talking to readers. It's my favorite thing. I get emails from readers all the time. My personal email is all over my website, easy to get me. I answer every single one of them. I mean, it might take me a few days, whatever, but I love hearing from readers. I love when readers say, I love this book. I love when readers say, I noticed you made a mistake on page 17. Actually, I don't love that. No. But you know what I'm saying? Like, I welcome it because it means people are reading and responding and stuff like that. So always feel free to do that anytime. Anytime. I go into schools a lot. Of those 645 appearances, I'd say 10% or 65 of them are in schools. Mostly high schools, but some middle schools. I'm going to high school this coming week, and then one the week after Thanksgiving week. And so I love going into schools and doing all that too. So yeah, it's wonderful. Been very blessed. I'm extremely blessed as an author. Can't say enough.
Thanks, it's been
Thank you.
enjoyable.
All right. Thanks, you guys. I'm going to be back there. Thank you very much.